A very warm welcome. You're joining us at Hyde Park on AdaDerana 24. We're talking about a looming food crisis, a hunger crisis world over, and in Sri Lanka, given the economic crisis, the shortage of foreign currency, the inability to secure sufficient foreign currency notes to enable essential procurement. Sri Lanka is faced with a dual crisis. Along with all this, we're talking about sustainable agriculture. What measures Sri Lanka can take going forward to ensure that people are well fed, that children are nourished. To discuss all of this, we've invited to our studios the representative of the Food and Agriculture Organization to Sri Lanka, Mr. Vimlendran, Sharan. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
You've been in Sri Lanka for about a year now. You arrived in Colombo in June 2021. Pretty much when here in Sri Lanka, everyone started talking about developments of a shortage of foreign currency, a crisis that Sri Lanka would inevitably step into. What was your experience like visiting here?
Yeah, it's been about a year since I came in here. Frankly, I came with the idea of exploring this beautiful country, and I thought I'm coming into a peaceful, non-crisis duty station, but it's been anything but that. And since I've come, we have had a series of crises facing us. It all started with the fertilizer ban, and it all then led into a major foreign exchange crisis and the economic crisis which the country is today facing. And the results are for everyone to see. Production is impacted, food availability and prices are an issue, and the common man, the poor, the vulnerable, they have been very, very badly and very negatively impacted in the process. So it's been a, I will not say a good journey, but it's been a very eventful 1 year for me till now, and there's been a lot of work. But that said, I think on the positive side, I find that the farmers in the country, the common people, they are extremely good, very warm, very welcoming. So it's been a mixed bag of experience, I would say, in Sri Lanka till now.
The FAO works in Sri Lanka on the ground with the farmer community, with other communities that directly impact the agricultural sector. But since you came in, what was your analysis of Sri Lanka going forward then in June?
The decision to ban chemical fertilizers and insecticides pesticides had already been taken when I arrived here. And I was absolutely clear, as were all technical people with me, that it was not an evidence-based scientific decision. We made a position very clear to the government. We met the government multiple times to advise them on the folly in shifting to organic agriculture overnight. There's nothing wrong as a vision in going organic, but there's a process to it. That process can't be short-circuited. And it appeared that the government desired to go green, go organic overnight, which in turn led to a major crisis with the farmers. Non-availability of chemical fertilizers, non-availability of pesticides, herbicides, has seen to a massive dip in production in Maha of 22.
We're talking about sustainability, going green, sustainable economies world over. So isn't organic a step that any nation should take as the next move towards being a sustainable economy, towards being going towards sustainable agro-based economy?
Absolutely. As I said, as a vision, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going green and going organic, and that's something that we would love if we did not compromise on the production side of things while going green. We have to remember that there's a huge population that we need to feed globally, and whether going completely green or completely 100% organic, enables us to feed that population or not is something which has to be considered. And there is a process. There's a timeline which needs to be followed. The soil has to be readied for that. The whole agriculture, agroeconomic processes have to be readied for that. It's like, as I mentioned earlier to someone, you want to have a child, your own child. Now, no matter how desperate you are for a child, you have to wait for those 9 months for the child. Similarly, no matter how desperate you are to go green or to go fully organic, there is a process that you have to follow. Our advice to the government was not that do not try this. Our advice was do not do it overnight. Do not ban everything overnight. There is a timeline which needs to be followed. There is a science to it. There is evidence to it. Follow that.
What is the scientific evidence-based recommendation of the timing for this transition?
It would take nearly 10 to 12 years to go through with this. There are examples. You take the example of Sikkim in India, which had desired to, or Bhutan, which had declared that it will go organic. They have all pushed their timelines because it's been a process. And remember that any policy will have a trade-off, including policy to go green. The trade-off here is food security. So while you're going green, are you taking adequate steps to ensure that people get what they need in terms of food? That seems to have been a mismatch in Sri Lanka. When you talk of a state like Sikkim within the larger country of India, even if the production in Sikkim goes down, the whole of India can easily look after the requirements. But what happens in Sri Lanka when the whole country is going organic and the production goes down? You have to have some policy in place, or you have to have a system in place to ensure that adequate food is available. One answer is that while the production dips as you transition from inorganic to organic, you can import more. But we must remember, as you rightly mentioned, that Sri Lanka is facing an economic crisis in terms of foreign exchange. Did you have enough foreign exchange in place to import what you needed? Now, as it has shown over the last 2, 3, 4 months, no, we did not. So there is a shortage, there is a crisis, because we went organic in a fashion which was not the scientific way to go about things.
When you arrived in Colombo, when this decision was taken, didn't the FAO or maybe your predecessors make any representation with the government on how this transition should be made, or wasn't the FAO consulted in this regard?
We did meet the government. We met the then minister, we met the then secretary. I have personally led a delegation of FAO and World Bank and EU to meet the minister, or the then secretary, to share with them our views and make it very eminently clear to them the impact of this decision likely on Sri Lanka. So at every step, FAO has been in discussion with the government and also sharing with the government what we thought was not the correct way of going about implementing this decision.
The World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Food Programme warn that acute food insecurity is likely to deteriorate further in 20 countries. And in Sri Lanka too, you've raised red flags over certain sectors and the agricultural industry especially. What are your observations currently, given the economic crisis and the shortages we're facing in essentials?
Multiple factors are playing out here. One is the global scenario. So globally, if you find the world over, food prices have gone up dramatically. Input prices have gone up dramatically. There have been reasons for that. For example, the Russian-Ukraine conflict has led to a major impact, and fuel has led to a major impact on fertilizers, availability and prices. Now, these global issues have their impact on every country because the world is so integrated, the economies are so integrated, and it has had its impact on Sri Lanka. Sadly for us, in Sri Lanka, what this global scenario is playing out at a time when our own country is extremely vulnerable in terms of its economy. The macroeconomic situation in Sri Lanka, as it has developed over the last 2, 3, 4 years, has brought us to a situation where we do not have enough foreign exchange with us to perhaps import and meet the shortfall which the country faces today from the production side. Whenever there be a shortfall, there are two ways to meet that. One is to increase production, the other way is to import from the world market. In Sri Lanka, there is a production problem because there are no inputs available to effectively meet the demand which the country has. In a normal year, perhaps we could have met this through a import of essential commodities, including food. But as things stand today, we are insufficiently geared towards production, but we also do not have the foreign exchange to import. So that gap of demand supply is not being met. And obviously that is going to have its own impact on inflation, and the inflationary pressure is extremely high. If I can share with you, I think the headline inflation has nearly touched 40, and I think 40% year on year, and food inflation is flirting around 58, 59%. So it's been a very, very tough 6-8 months for the consumers in this country, and things are not going to become easy over the coming 2-3 months, 5 months.
What immediate changes or mechanisms do you recommend Sri Lanka implement at this stage of the crisis?
At this stage, I think it's important that we have a strategy running parallel. One which looks at the immediate food requirements, where you import food and perhaps make it available in the open market for people to access, because there is no way that you can get adequate production in a 15-day or 1-month period. Agriculture has its own timeline. But I think it's equally important for Sri Lanka to realize, for the policymakers to realize, for the international donors to realize that we cannot and should not in any way weaken the production system in the country. We have to take steps to really strengthen the farmer's hand, provide adequate inputs in time for the farmer to take to production. Sri Lanka has to become self-reliant in its production. Importing food and giving food for consumption is a very, it becomes a vicious cycle of sorts. We need to strengthen production, and these are not simultaneous. These are simultaneous activities. These are not subsequent to the other. So while we are talking of bringing in food or food aid for those who are poor and vulnerable, simultaneously we have to strengthen the production capacity. And Sri Lankan agriculture in the past has shown that it is capable of meeting the requirements of the country. We were self-sufficient in paddy just 2 years back. So we can still become self-sufficient. The farmers are good. They are really good. Sri Lankan farmers are one of the best I've met. They are extremely educated, open to innovation, open to good ideas. It is we as policymakers perhaps who need to take that extra step to bring forth to them what they require. That is something which I hope government, international organizations like ours, donors, they all keep that perspective in mind, that it cannot be either or. It has to be both. It has to be import of food for distribution as aid, but it also has to be inputs and strengthening of the production capacity of the agriculture community.
You spoke about empowering the farmer community, strengthening their capacity to engage in economic activity. But at the same time, given the shortages and the risks to global supply chain, Sri Lanka is faced with this crisis as we have a foreign exchange dearth, and also a hit to supply chains because we are so dependent on imported items. In managing this situation and going towards a sustainable economy, what are your thoughts on how long and the timeline Sri Lanka will take to go into that sustainability, self-reliance, self-sufficiency going forward?
Difficult question to answer in terms of timeline, but I would say the economy will not come back to its original self in anything short of 5 to 7 years. But agriculture sector can. And it can come back to its original strong self if we provide adequate help and adequate support to the farmers to ensure that they take to productive activities at the earliest. If Maha of 22-23 and Yala of 23 pick up, I think we can look at a stabilized agricultural economy or agriculture sector production within about a year, year and a half. Let me give you a few facts and figures which needs to be kept in mind. Fuel, it's a big crisis. The government today has a quota of 120 liters per acre to the paddy farmer, which is extremely inadequate. Now, the question is, how do you prioritize fuel for agriculture? And that's a policy decision of the government which needs to be taken. I feel that it is important that we do prioritize. Even for that 120 liters, the farmer has to get 3 government officials to certify. The Grama Niladhari, then an agriculture inspector, and one more official, 3 officials are involved to certify a minimal amount of 120 liters, for which the poor farmer then has to stand in line. Now, minus the fuel, how are you going to look at it? How are you going to revive agriculture? Look at the agriculture credit limit. That is still capped at 30,000 rupees an acre. The input prices have gone up four times. The labor cost has gone up 4 to 6 times. But the agriculture credit limit is the same. What has happened? Because of that, farmers are now pawning off their little bit of whatever ornaments or gold that they had, or whatever saving that they had. It's all being pawned just to meet the expenses of sowing seed and looking after the cultivation. So we need to immediately think about raising credit limits, agriculture credit limits for the farmers. These are steps which need to be taken immediately to help revive Sri Lankan agriculture. And if we do that, if we provide the inputs, I'm confident that we can make a move towards sustainability in agriculture sector. Having said that, there is a great need to make Sri Lankan agriculture more environment friendly and also more sustainable in terms of its use of inputs.
What do you mean by more environmental friendly?
Today, our prescribed rate of fertilizer application in the country today is 225 kgs per hectare. And the fertilizer efficiency in Sri Lanka is only 30%. Most of the fertilizer, especially urea that we are applying, is leaching into the soil and causing harm to the water bodies, to the soil and the environment. Can we increase the fertilizer use efficiency? I think we can. Sri Lanka needs to get on immediately onto an integrated plant nutrient management strategy, where the use of chemical fertilizer comes down and the use of organic matter goes up. We need to popularize and immediately work on good agriculture practices. And pilots have shown. We did a 4 million Jeff-operated, Jeff-funded project, which has just finished with about local farmers, about 400 odd farmers. And we saw that the production can be maintained at the same level by using as little as only 30 to 40% of the original fertilizer these farmers were using. So there are ways and means in which we can work to make the agriculture sector less resource intensive while maintaining the production levels. It requires funding, it requires commitment, and it requires policies. We need a 100% commitment of the department, of the government, of the agencies into this exercise. And we can do it. As I said, the farmer in Sri Lanka, to my mind, is ready to change. But we have to incentivize that change. We have to educate the farmers towards that. I don't think the pushback is from the farmers. We need to really work with them because we are changing the way they worked over years. So we have to be very careful in how we put forward a solution to them. But I am confident that the government will be able to do it if it puts its mind and heart behind it.
You're saying we need to make that transition to organic. That is the solution, but not in the aggression and urgency that it was implemented before. But at the same time, you're talking about funding here. At this stage, how do you think the FAO can support Sri Lanka going forward to make that transition towards an environmental friendly and sustainable agro-based economy?
Let me put this in a perspective. International organizations are not government, and I'm making it very clear. Nationwide change has to come through government and government-backed policies. We do not substitute governments. We are here to help governments, perhaps by bringing best practices, perhaps by bringing science, perhaps by doing some pilots. Currently, we are working with Government of Australia, DFAT, on a $1 million program where we are working with farmers on gap technology, in addition to farmers on, not farmers, but schools on school gardens, and also through other programs on home gardens. Now, these are pilots which can be scaled. So once we have done a pilot, we expect government to step in to scale it up. Because, as I mentioned, these fundings can never substitute a government budget. What we require is a commitment from policy and budget side from the government. And we are ready to help. We do work with government. Like, for example, I'm working with CEDA on an anticipatory action program in the country. We are working on a $700,000 program in the country today to help in green gram cultivation. As I mentioned, we are working with DFAT on a $1 million program to help bring forth gap work within the farmers. We are working with Government of New Zealand. We are working with Government of Canada to improve upon seeds within the country. Currently, we are working on chili and big onion. So there are various projects which FAO has taken. Besides that, FAO also works on global projects where Sri Lanka is a part. Currently, we are working with the Government of Norway on 3 components in the fisheries sector to reduce fisheries loss and waste, to make fisheries more adaptive to environment change, which is causing changes in the ocean, the fisheries, the current patterns, the acidification of oceans, so how to handle that. So there are these projects there. We have just now concluded an agreement with Government of Korea to bring in about $1 million to work with the fisheries sector on biosecurity. So there are multiple projects on which we work. We have worked extensively on the urban side under a CRFS program of FAO and prepared the municipal corporation to work, council to work on food waste and reduction of food waste, the steps that are needed to be taken. We are working with the Ministry of Environment with that. So these programs are all in place, and FAO is committed to work with the government and with the other funding agencies to ensure that we bring in these pilots, bring in the science, bring in the evidence, and help the government work with the farmers. I'd
like to, before we go in for a short break, talk again about fertilizer to support the agro industry here. Sri Lanka is relying on India for support in providing fertilizer, especially urea, which is banned in Sri Lanka, but India is extending that support. So how do we make this possible now in terms of fertilizer arrangements for the farmer community?
There are 3 things simultaneously playing out in this. One is the bilateral aid which Government of Sri Lanka will get. For example, the 65,000 metric ton of Indian urea that you have just mentioned. That comes in as a bilateral aid from India, and the government is negotiating with India on that. I think that urea should reach Sri Lanka by mid-July, if not earlier. The second line is the credit line which flows from World Bank and ADB. So World Bank has earmarked 110 million for import of urea into the country. ADB has earmarked 35 or 40 million for import of MOP into the country. That's the credit line, which works again through the government. The third line is where donors come and work through agencies like FAO. So we are in negotiations with USAID, we're in negotiations with EU. We have made a submission to the UN emergency funding to bring in urea under FAO tender to be able to distribute it to very small farmers, farmers having land holdings only up to 1 acre, 0 to 1 acre, that's all, to be able to distribute this. So it's a multi-pronged attack on the problem, and we hope that adequate urea is in place prior to start of the Maha season sowing in October. Now we have to understand that Yala is nearly over now. So any fertilizer coming into the country now is not going to really impact Yala yield and productivity. So we sadly will be seeing a dip in Yala production again. I think if I can hazard a guess, it would be again a 50% dip minimum. But if we are able to put adequate fertilizer in place for the Maha sowing, I think from there onwards, hopefully Sri Lankan agriculture can pick up.
Would you term it as a severe shortage of fertilizer in Sri Lanka?
Oh yes, absolutely. There is no fertilizer in the country. We need fertilizer. We needed it yesterday. There is a complete shortage, and we need it as fast as we can.
Is this food crisis probably a result of the decisions that were taken, or do you see certain other factors that led to, that affected the agricultural industry?
It has played out, as I mentioned, on two counts. One, that the production has suffered because of the decision to go organic and ban import of chemical fertilizers into the country. That impacted the production side. So there is a dip in production, nearly 50% in Maha. And to counter that, there was an urgency to bring in essential commodities, including food, through imports. But sadly for Sri Lanka, we had a major economic crisis. We still have one, and there was not enough foreign exchange available to do those imports at prices where consumers can access. So it was a double whammy. We didn't have adequate production. We didn't have enough imports coming in. And the result is for everyone to see. There is shortage of food, and what food is available is extremely costly. So you would have experienced going to the supermarket. Prices have gone up 4 times, 5 times, 6 times of any commodity across the board, whether it is vegetables or milk or egg or poultry or dal or rice, any commodity, and the prices have just jumped up.
We'll take a short break here at Hyde Park. We're in conversation with the resident representative of the Food and Agriculture Organization in Sri Lanka. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we are in discussion with the FAO representative in Sri Lanka, Mr. Vimlendra Sharan. We've been talking about agriculture in Sri Lanka. You yourself very close to agriculture practice. You come from a small village in India, quite hands-on on production, on harvesting, using bullock carts. Tell us your experience there in India.
Long time ago, but yes, I come from a very small village in Bihar, in India, which is on the border of India with Nepal. And we have a small farm there. When I was growing up, of course, it was very, very traditional farming. There was no machinery at all. We used to till the land using bullocks, and we used to even harvest with the bullocks going around and around the crop. So, and I've done all that. So I've seen agriculture in its most traditional form. But over the years, I did start working in the sector and got myself a lot of experience working with farmers in various parts of the country, especially in the state of Maharashtra. Worked with Government of India for nearly 27 years, of which I have spent a majority part linked to agriculture and food, and have seen the farming in India grow from a very traditional, non-mechanized farming practice to what is now in many parts a highly innovative and a highly technical farming practice. So have seen the gamut, and that's a reason why I feel very excited in Sri Lanka, because Sri Lankan farming is on a growth path, and we can actually take it to a completely another level, bringing in more innovation and science.
But Sri Lanka is still trying to popularize farming among the younger community, the youth community. Of course, there are segments of the youth who have embarked on farming agro products and projects. But how do you recommend that Sri Lanka approach this, make it more attractive for the young people to be a part of this changed economy that we're looking at?
This geriatrification or geriatric nature of agriculture is a global phenomenon. Across the world, we find that younger people are not taking to agriculture because they are not excited by the back-breaking, out in the sun practice, which is what they associate with agriculture. But agriculture actually can be made very, very exciting. It can become extremely scientific. I have also been to farms where hundreds and hundreds of acres are cultivated by 4 people. We're using drones and using AI, and sitting in a cabin and controlling the irrigation system with the press of a button. All that is possible. And agriculture can be made very, very attractive. And that is the only way, I think, in which we can bring youth back into agriculture. If we try selling agriculture in its present form to the young, they are not going to come back. And forget the youth. I don't think even the farmers who are doing agriculture today want their children to come back to agriculture. They're pushing them out. So we have to make agriculture more scientific, more innovative. Also, we have to increase the returns to the farmers. So if I am going to dedicate my life to a particular sector or a particular business, then it must give me the return. And farming should not be looked at as anything other than a private business enterprise. We have to have a very business orientation towards farming to understand what is the return which comes to the farmer. It's not a social service, it's not a philanthropy which makes people do farming. I'm not doing farming to feed you. I'm doing farming to earn my income to feed myself. And that perspective must be kept in mind. So I will not be able to feed you unless I earn enough income myself. Once we do that, I think we have a chance of getting the youth back into the fold. Today, it's not a love marriage between the youth and agriculture. If at all, it's a forced marriage where willy-nilly the youth is being pushed to stay with agriculture, whether he likes it or he doesn't like it. And such marriages would normally not last. So I would prefer if it be a love marriage where the youth actually likes to be with agriculture and cultivate. And there are numerous countries and numerous places where this is happening, where the young people are taking to farming, to agriculture. But as I said, they are averse to back-baking in the sense of agriculture. They want more scientific and more technologically oriented agriculture.
For nearly 3 decades in India, you've been focusing on development, rural development, agriculture and policy related to this sector. Hunger is possibly nothing new to you. You've probably seen this, and you've probably come up with policies, supported policy decisions to overcome these. But the current situation world over and in Sri Lanka, how do you observe this, and what stringent measures? Yes, we spoke about the challenges and mechanisms, but what stringent measures do you think economies, and especially Sri Lanka, should implement?
Let me take one step back here. There are 3 factors today playing in the global agriculture food scenario, which is causing us a lot of concern. One is climate change and its impact. The second is conflict around the world, which has a huge impact on food security. And the third is the macroeconomic instability. All these factors combined, when also seen in the context of 2 years of pandemic, which really disrupted the global economy, have seen to nearly 193 million people now suffering from acute malnutrition. And this figure is up by nearly 40 odd million in the last 2 years. Sri Lanka is falling today in the third category, where there is a macroeconomic instability, which is causing problems in the sector, both in terms of providing inputs as also in terms of providing adequate food accessible at a reasonable price to the people to maintain a healthy and active life. And this has played out very starkly on the poor and vulnerable, including the children. And we fear Sri Lanka in any case was not doing very well on the malnutrition front. You have a situation where nearly 17% of the Sri Lankan children are suffering from stunting, another 15% are suffering from wasting. In that you bring in COVID, in that you bring in this crisis, and I'm quite sure that we have gone a step, gone
Does
backwards.
this mean children will be hard hit going further? Absolutely.
Children will be extremely hard hit. Pregnant and lactating mothers will be extremely hard hit. A third of pregnant and breastfeeding mothers in this country anyways are anemic. If you do not provide them adequate food, nutritious food, obviously that number is going to go up further. So this is definitely a very, very vulnerable section of the society we are talking about. Urban poor is going to be very badly impacted. In the rural community, the farmers and the landholders who are holding very small pieces of land, say half an acre, 1 acre, these are farmers who grow for their own sustenance. They do not bring food to the market to sell. Now imagine a situation where nearly 39 or 40% of farmers who fall in this bracket are not able to grow enough for their own consumption. Obviously, all this is going to play out in a big way. So we have to be very careful when we do our planning and when we do our identification of beneficiaries and targeting of beneficiaries, that the help must go first and foremost to these vulnerable sections of the society.
Are there any tested and proven mechanisms that a country could use in scenarios as this, in situations as this, where you directly target those vulnerable and those most in need?
Absolutely. We have done this across the globe in similar situations elsewhere. We use proxy indicators. For example, if I were to provide fertilizer today to the farming sector, who would I go to? I would immediately target farmers who are smallholders, who are cultivating less than an acre of land. I would immediately target women farmers. I would immediately target households where women are leading the household, the men folk are not there. I would immediately target such households where we have instances of severely malnourished children, which is already on government record. So there are these proxy indicators which we use to do our targeting exercise. And they have been applied all across the globe, and they have worked very well. You will always have your percentage of inclusion and exclusion errors. That's fine. But we need to minimize those errors as much as possible. If I can keep them within 1% or 0.5%, I'm happy. But if my exclusion and inclusion errors are 20%, then I have to relook at my targeting exercise.
How does the UN Joint Humanitarian Needs and Priorities Plan? We heard that $47 million will be has been pledged to support some 1.7 million people. But how does this support the vulnerable communities and those urgently in need of aid?
So my first I need to check you on the use of the word pledge. This is an appeal to the global community from the UN in Sri Lanka asking for the money. The money has not yet been pledged. So how did this come about? So the humanitarian needs and priorities plan, the agencies came together and put forth for their own specific sectors, like FAO would put forth for agriculture, UNICEF will put forth for children and for women, health will, WHO will put forth for health. So we put forth for a program where we intend helping the most vulnerable, and then costed it, and that's how we arrive at a figure of 47.2 million, where about 1.7 million people we feel are very badly impacted and need help. This was launched on 8th of June, and the figures have only gone up, so we need much more. So 47.2 was for 1.7, but now many more people are impacted, so we need much more. Within this 47.2, our role from FAO, which looks at smallholder farmers and vulnerable farmers, we have sought funding of 14.9 million to reach out to nearly 398,000 smallholder paddy farmers who cultivate from 0 to 1 acre of land. So we are hopeful to generate funding from donors, both bilateral, multilateral, on the global scale, and meet this and even go beyond.
What really is the FAO's mandate, and how do you delegate this work in Sri Lanka?
On a global scale, FAO is a technical institution. Our primary mandate is to help governments improve their technical capacity, build their capacities to take to sustainable and innovative and technically scientific agricultural practices. That's our broader aim. But within that, there are multiple things that we look at. And when I am talking of agriculture, I don't talk only of crops, including fisheries, I'm including livestock. But within that, there are multiple situations which play out. For example, in Sri Lanka today, it's more of an emergency role that we are looking at. So what do we do in an emergency? Now, in an emergency, FAO would move in with helping farmers on inputs, say seeds, say fertilizer, and also help them understand in the best way possible how to take to innovative farming practices to become more resilient and gain back the lost ground. How do we get them back on their feet fast? Well, that's a primary goal and aim at this moment. Once we have them up and about and cultivating, then we step in again to help them with more scientific advice, more technical capacity building, take them away from their current practices to what we think is a more sustainable agricultural practice. So these roles play out depending on the context. We have traditionally in Sri Lanka been very, very deeply involved with the ministry in policy making, in giving policy advice and giving technical advice to the ministry. We also, I must share, the repository of the richest database globally that you can have on agriculture. Sometimes I refer to our database, which gives me easier access about Sri Lankan agriculture than to the database of the ministry here, which is sometimes extremely difficult to navigate.
You talk about the FAO says Sri Lanka will experience further deterioration of food security, and we've spoken much about this situation. At the same time, from an economic perspective, we're looking at investments into the country, and agriculture could be an industry that could attract these investments. But does the FAO have an understanding or an observation on what areas and how Sri Lanka can immediately attract investments to either joint projects that are also funded by the government or technical support given through the FAO? What is the possibility here?
We have a very vibrant program for partnership with private sector, and when we look at private sector, we don't look only in terms of the money that they bring. Private sector across the globe is full of rich experience. They are full of expertise, they are full of innovation, they are full of technology, full of science. And those are also areas which we really need to tap into. So it has to be a very holistic exercise, and with private sector, and that's been my constant pitch, that we are partners. We have to bring them as a partner. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, agriculture is business. And I would not want private sector's entry into agriculture if I'm looking at a long-term partnership in terms of philanthropy or their corporate social responsibility, because that can only touch the surface. If you want to integrate private sector into any country's agriculture, you have to ensure that it works as a business. The returns must be there. It cannot be on a philanthropic basis. It should not be on a philanthropic basis, because then the private sector is here today, it's out tomorrow. We have to bring in private players where returns to the sector, whether it be the complete value chain, has to be there. I'll give you an example of what we are doing with private sector here. On this work that we are doing with DFAT, we have already spoken to Cargills and Keels, and we're trying to see if a partnership can be built there for ensuring that what the gap-enabled farmer produces finds a shelf in Cargills or Keels or other such supermarkets, because that will be at a premium. Now, that's a role which the private sector can easily play as a partner, where it's a win-win situation both for the farmer and for the business enterprise. We are partnering, say, with Google on developing real-time data for forest cover in the world. We are partnering with MasterCard for ensuring that the cards that we give out to farmers across many countries in Africa are backed by the MasterCard technology. So there are so many areas in which private sectors can come in, and there are excellent private sector players in the agriculture sector who can help countries grow. I was speaking to a company called East West Seeds from Netherlands, which specialize in production of vegetable seeds, and they are doing excellent work in Myanmar, in India, and there is no reason why we can't bring them in to Sri Lanka to help the vegetable farmers in Sri Lanka. So we have to look at private sector in a with a lens of being equal partners, rather than in the terms of you come and invest, or you come and give us some money, or CSR or philanthropy. So it's a huge role that they have, and that they should be encouraged to play.
Finally, before we wrap up, I'd like to go back to FAO UN reports where you warn of acute food crisis, and in Sri Lanka it still looks like the gravity of the situation is not understanding. But should we be frightened about this? Should we take this situation more seriously than we are? Because we heard the Prime Minister too, when he took office, saying that the situation will get worse than it gets better. But could this continue to be worse?
If this interview be a wake-up call, then so be it. I think we are facing a very grave crisis, and we should not underplay this situation. And my only take on this is, don't just go by numbers, because they don't give you an accurate picture. Sometimes you have to understand the pain of the person who's facing hunger, and we have to try and work for that. As I said, 193 million people in the world are facing acute malnutrition and food insecurity. Now try and imagine somebody you love as part of that 193. And then you will understand how bad the situation is. The country today, Sri Lanka, sadly, is facing a grave situation. The government is appraised of this. Agencies, international agencies, are fully knowing what's happening. And everybody is working to help the country come out of this. Sadly for us, there are so many other hotspots in the country which perhaps is taking some bit of attention away from Sri Lanka. Say what is happening in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Ukraine. So a lot of the world focus is getting, divided into many arenas, and Sri Lanka has to find a place there. I would say that while we are working with international communities on all this, the country by itself also must work diligently and ensure that we come out of this situation as soon as possible. But it is serious. It is serious.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, expertise and observations. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you, and wish you all the best. Thanks.
Thank you. We had with us the FAO representative in Sri Lanka, Mr. Vimlendra Sharan, a member of the Indian Administrative Service for nearly 3 decades and with the UN for more than 6 years now, sharing thoughts on Sri Lanka's agricultural industry and measures ahead of a food crisis. We'll see you again next week at the same time with yet another discussion. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.